Okay, I'm going to make a start. So welcome to you all to today's Childhood and Society seminar series. I've lost count of which seminar this is, but it's one of many, many, and you're very welcome. So this is part of a series that's been running for approximately 5 years, maybe more. And the idea is that it's a place for educational scholars at Middlesex University to share their research with each other and with the world out there. And it's intended to be a safe space, a comfortable space where we can present our warts and all research. Sometimes it's published research, sometimes it's work in progress, and sometimes it's just an idea we have. But it's really an opportunity for our colleagues and peers to give us some insights about what they think about the research that we're doing. So today's seminar is presented by myself and Victoria de Rijke, and this is very much a fresh piece of research. We've literally just submitted it. So it's very fresh in our minds, and yeah, it's a lively piece and it's quite experimental. And yeah, so the intention is that we will talk for approximately 35-40 minutes, and after which there'll be time for questions and hopefully a bit of discussion. If you want to stay on until 1 o'clock, you're very welcome to. And yeah, just populate the chat with your questions as we go along, and we'll gather them up towards the end and then have, hopefully, as I say, a chance to kind of discuss and debate what's come from the presentation. So I'm going to set up the PowerPoint. Oh, it's not going to misbehave, is it?
Why was the gate open?
Let's try that again.
Oh, I'm in the meeting. Just make sure.
Right, could I please ask people to pop themselves on mute, just so that it's only the speakers that can be heard? That would be great. Thanks very much. Okay, so this is the title of our presentation. I'm going to hand over to Victoria de Rijke, Professor Victoria de Rijke, to introduce and get us started on this seminar presentation.
Thanks, Jane. Down the back of a chair. What does a method of scrabbling with Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction offer conceptualizations of the child in the Anthropocene? Here you can see the title, as I've just read it, and the 3 contributors to the research. So you may not necessarily recognize them directly, except for the fact that Jane, of course, still does somewhat look like a little pixie. One of the contributors is not speaking today. She's at school, and she is my neighbour, Laura Rosa. And Laura Rosa is one of the very agential participants in this research. She and I do a lot of hanging out. We both live on boats in South London, and in the boat community you have quite a close relationship, rather like a small village, where when people are in trouble they help one another out. And during lockdown last year, which is when we began this research, Laura Rosa's parents approached me and said, now we have this opportunity, as Laura Rosa's not at school, here are the difficulties she's been having because she's dyslexic. And I knew about those already because Laura Rosa had told me that she didn't like English and the reasons she didn't like to read or write. I could see, as somebody who's worked in teacher training for many years, that she was having difficulty. And for Laura Rosa, lockdown was an opportunity that she did not waste, which was to re-engage with what she's really good at in terms of what turned out to be literacy, but which looked like drawing skills, art skills, discussion skills, all sorts of other skills, which she brings to what she would call research. You can see here she's wearing her science glasses, And one of Laura Rosa's passions, like mine, is to go mudlarking, where we go down onto the shoreline of the River Thames and we look for treasures. And she sees that as a very science and history related topic, so she always wears her special goggles. And she became a very strong component of our research in sort of exploring the things that, the questions we were asking in terms of conceptualizations of the child, and, you know, what counts as research and who you do research with. And we'll explain that further. So we were, the study came about basically in response to an invitation for Jayne and I to submit an entry into an edited collection called Children's Literature Studies After Childhood. The collection's designed to gather together post-humanist approaches to childhood studies. And you can see here, there's a huge list which they sent out originally for us to consider. But you can tell by my brief introduction that it already caught our attention because we were interested in working with a host of not human and non-human and more than human others. We wanted to have fresh thinking about childhood literacy, books and research, and what counts as valid knowledge, and how we could playfully challenge some of these entrenched and unhelpful ideas about the child, which are still currently framed in an unhelpful sort of developmentalist logic.
Okay, so we had some conversations about how precisely we might respond to this invitation that could draw upon our mutual and shared interest, passions and politics. And we were broadly in agreement that this needed to be a playfully serious following Donna Haraway project that could bring feminist critique together with creativity, following Rosie Braidotti's idea about the generative possibilities of bringing critique and creativity together. And we really wanted, as Victoria says, to disrupt, to really challenge, dismantle, disrupt, and seek to find ways to reconfigure some entrenched and unhelpful ideas about childhood literacy, books and research. So specifically, we saw the research and the publication itself as a key opportunity to resist what we consider to be a growing canonization of post-humanist studies and childhood. So what we're recognizing is that there are identifiable ways to do post-humanism, and there's a trend and a pattern of a sort of sedimented way of recognizing a post-humanist study. And we wanted to kind of push back against that a bit and say, oh, you know, the premise of post-humanism is that it's about innovation, it's about creativity, it's about critique, it's about the new, but it's also about respecting where knowledge comes from and how knowledge practices are produced. So how could we kind of jump back into that space and think really creatively, collaboratively and innovatively, and whilst decentering the child, making the child a core part of our research. So that was really fundamental to what we wanted to do. And we saw this as fundamentally feminist praxis. So it's about what we do in forms of collaboration, and it's about who we are, where we are, and all the processes that are involved. I'm thinking very, very seriously and deeply about this sort of second wave mantra of the personal is political. For us, it still remains the same. The personal is political, but the personal is not the sealed human subject. It has these tentacles that reach out, and that's really what we wanted to get at. And the other thing to stress is, as maybe Victoria's introduction there suggested, is that it's about the everyday, the mundane, the habitual, the stuff that unfolds that can seem quite unremarkable, but when you actually take the time to slow down and engage in a really deep and meaningful way, then there are lots of wonderful surprises just waiting there to be engaged with. So yeah, essentially for us it was about a feminist praxis of bringing creativity and critique together. So in the kind of driving force for this was this tiny book. Le Guin's The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. And I was really taken by it, not just the content, but It's As Matter, being this tiny book that had beautiful little illustrations, philosophy, provocations, feminist theory, just everything in this tiny, very slim book. And Victoria and I kind of engaged with this and said, could we use this? How might we use this? How could this be part of our research praxis? How could we put this to work? And what's really fun about it, I suppose, is it's precisely the size and shape that would get lost down the back of a chair. So it became a very active, agentic part of our research process. And so this idea of the carrier bag theory of fiction, and gathering rather than hunting and tracking down and identifying, and gathering, foraging and scrummaging around and bringing all these irreducible parts together, and this idea of the bag holding things, not finding explanations or coherent narratives so much as all these bits coming together to produce other ways to think and be in the world. So we started to feel, actually, sense a methodology starting to emerge from Victoria's relationship with Laura Rosa and our beginnings to think about how the carrier bag theory of fiction might be helpful to us in our research. So our methodology became very much about rummaging, remembering and relocating. So it was these turning over, as Haraway calls it, composting. So the memories and affects that started to resurface, and we all started to think, feel, do with the book's liveliness. So it was about gathering and foraging, and it was both emergent and speculative. So the bag theory manifest for us in this research holds our collective resistances to notions of the child, the non-human, the book or literacy, resistance to research practices privileging the adult, academic, written, seeable knowledges over others, including resistance to theorising the child as part of a delimiting pre-propositional orders in the analysis of childhood nature. So as well as some of the feminist foremothers, we also had a little dance with Deleuze and Guattari, and particularly their framework of assemblage theory that allows for relational fluidity in systems, what they call constellations or imaginative articulations. And these were very helpful to us too in the series of multimodal assemblage methods that we seek to offer through this research experiment and within the paper itself. And it was a means for us to practice mutually constitutive carrier bag scrabbling. And scrabbling about was very perplexing to the editors of the book. There's too much Scrabble, everything's scrabbling. What is this scrabbling? So scrabbling became this emergent methodology for us that was really helpful and very, very post-human. And for us, it revealed the endless, uncertain, emergent possibilities for the what else that Erin Manning writes about when the human is decentered. And we celebrate the vitality of the post-human child to innovative arts-based research, concluding that this methodology, which infiltrates and inflects our everyday lives, so post-humanism is not something you do separate from living, it's all becomes very entangled and enmeshed, but it frees us. We felt a sense of freedom as researchers to embrace possibilities for what else a book can be, what else a child can be, and what else children's literature studies and childhood research might become.
Down the back of the chair. Our car is slow to start and go. We can't afford a new one. Now, if you please, Dad's lost the keys. We're facing wreck and ruin. No car, no work, no pay. We're getting poorer day by day. No wonder Dad is looking grey. The future is a blue one. Nothing but dockets in his pockets, raging with despair. Dad acts appalled. Though fairly bald, he tries to tear his hair. But Mary, who is barely 2, says, Dad should do what I would do. I lose a lot, but I find a few down the back of the chair. Well, he's patted himself. He's searched each shelf. He's hunted here and there, so now he'll kneel and try to feel down the back of the chair. Oh, it seemed to grin as his hand went in. He felt it quiver against his skin. What will the troubled father win from down the back of the chair? Some hairy string and a diamond ring were down the back of the chair. Pineapple peel and a conger eel were down the back of the chair. A sip, a sup, a sop, a song. A spider, 7 inches long. No wonder that it smells so strong down the back of the chair. A packet of pins and one of the twins were down the back of the chair. A fan, a pan that belonged to Gran down the back of the chair. A cup, a comb, a crown, a cap. A pirate with a treasure map. A dragon trying to take a nap down the back of the chair. A drake, a rake, a smiling snake were down the back of the chair. A string of pearls, a lion with curls down the back of the chair. A skink, a skunk, a skate, a ski. A couple of elephants drinking tea. The bandicoot and the bumblebee were down the back of the chair. But what is this? Oh, bliss, down the back of the chair. The long-lost will of Uncle Bill, down the back of the chair. His money box all filled with cash, tangled up on the scarlet sash. This treasure, pleasure, toys and trash, down the back of the chair. I found our dreams, our father beams, down the back of the chair. Well, at last I see how life can be down the back of the chair. Forget the keys. We're poor no more, just call a taxi to the door. The taxi shot out with a roar from down the back of the chair. The chair, the chair, the challenging chair, the champion chair, the cheerful chair, the charming chair, the children's chair, the chipped and chopped but chosen chair. To think our fortune rested there, down the back of the chair.
So that voice is Margaret Moyes, the author of the book, Down the Back of the Chair. And if you didn't see the images, then have a look at her reading it. It's lovely. And it was a book that we chose because obviously the title comes from that, but it's also very much about this scrabbling that takes place and what gets found. We'll return to that in a moment, but we'll first talk about the kind of methodology. So the book, do you want to go back to the book, Jayne?
Sorry.
So this is my copy, and this is the title page of my copy. Margaret Moy is a highly award-winning New Zealand author, probably best known for young adolescent fantasy fiction, but she has a lot of humorous stories in rhyme as well that are very popular. And this is one of those. Down the Back of the Chair, illustrated by Polly Dunbar, is on the International Outstanding Books list, categorized as a picture book because every page is fully illustrated. It's in itself an assemblage composed of 16 double-page spreads of unrecycled paper featuring rhyming text and colourful images in pen, ink, cut paper and watercolour wash. So it's actually really is a kind of collage assemblage in terms of the illustration. It was printed and barcoded in China and published by Frances Lincoln in 2006, originally costing £6.99, but I bought it secondhand from an Oxfam shop in the UK where it was marked £3. At the cash till, I noticed that it had this green sticker. If you look right over on the left, there's a little green sticker called Green Reader. And it had been a library book in Slough, February 2010. I expect that library was closed down, I said sadly at the time, because since 2010, consecutive Conservative governments have shut over 800 libraries in the name of austerity in Britain. And the person selling the book said, "Oh, because it has scribbles on it, I'll let you have it for £1." And although this is another story, the fact that it has scribbles on it makes it more valuable for me. So that was a huge bargain. So we can only speculate about the sort of journeys, the story this book has had, what the economics and conditions for workers of the publishers outsourcing their printing to China are, what the sticker signifies in reading level in the UK, who donated it to Oxfam, Oxfam itself as a charitable organisation focusing on alleviating the same global poverty that is, of course, contaminated by British publishing houses outsourcing printers, where workers are paid below the living wage. My buying it with a £1 coin that I scrabbled for in my pocket, reading it with Laura Rosa and Jayne, giving us the idea for scrabbling down the back of our chairs to think about all of the life we found in the chairs we read in and in the books we read. And over its 15 years so far, this book has become a host of other matter: microbes, organisms, memories, dust, hair, and fibre particles or parasites, fingerprints, microstains, composting and congregating over the many journeys it's taken: New Zealand, UK, China, UK, globally, who knows, all mostly imperceptible to the human eye. During its life as a library book, children of Slough may have handled it whilst crying, picking their noses, or eating, as might book lice, who also frequent libraries to feed on books. In 2019, the largest library in the city of Marseille in France had to be closed due to a so-called infestation of bedbugs brought in by readers. Mites, like book lice or bedbugs, are parasitical in that they feed on matter such as the paper, the binding pastes and glues in books, and they also burrow down for moisture. The book effectively becomes what Anna Tsing calls a disturbance-based ecology, where matter scrabbles into matter without harmony or conquest, recalling Le Guin's cultural carrier bag theory: gathering, holding, and sharing.
I'm listening to a lecture. And I can see. You don't know that, like, they can't hear me.
Yes,
we can hear you.
So here are some drawings done by Laura Rosa. When we're discussing, having read down the back of the chair, what a book is and what reading is to her. And to remember that Laura Rosa is strongly dyslexic child, so reading has already been a somewhat traumatic event at school, something that she's been given the impression she's bad at. And so for Laura Rosa, reading in utopian and benign spaces are not in school. You can see here, one, the chair is a rabbit and the children are inside the rabbit, inside the woods. There's a kind of ladder to a thought cloud. You know, it shows a complex process of coziness, of thoughts occurring, all contained within animal, within what she would see as friendly animal, one of her favourites. And chair as duck is a creature that we see on the dock a great deal. And again, the children are both inside and outside, reading. They have their own space and also shared space. There's a swing hanging in a very upside down, surreal way from the duck's beak, and its eye as a star that you can look through as the perfect reading light. And when you read, you float around too. The school chair, in huge contrast, has pins all on the seat, a great big light on you. You can see 100 watts, no, 10,000 watts light, a fork to stab you if you get it wrong. And I will, because my brain works way worse in chairs at school. she says. Notice that the figure of the teacher is also completely faceless. And for me, this links very strongly to notions of Western literacy, dominated by this developmental normative standards that children can often feel they fall below. I once asked a group of children, "What are you reading?" "I can't read," answered a child. I'm only an orange." So just like the green reader only being an orange means that for this child, reading has already become nothing more than a process of labeling. And I think for both Jayne and I, this links strongly to what we want to challenge about developmentalist logic and childhood. Literacy, the sort of so-called reading wars that both the US and the UK have been exposed to, basically relate to the politics of reading over the past 30 years, having become a kind of scapegoat for neoliberal policy reforms, increasingly adjusting the teaching of reading to standardised national tests and Ofsted inspections for market comparison. Plenty of reports, such as the CLPE report, Reading for Purpose and Pleasure from 2021, have noted that over that period and the pandemic, children have less access to books, less support in reading for pleasure, and it's a national concern. The UK is one of the worst countries in the world, in fact, for children continuing to read after school. They stop reading when they are stopped being told they have to, in other words. And we also have this issue that if you're not reading by 5, everyone starts to worry, teachers and parents begin to worry, despite the fact that well-known British authors like Beverly Naidoo, Michael Rosen, Philip Pullman have been lobbying for years to give children books, not SATs, standard attainment tests, arguing that tests limit teaching, ruin poetry, and deny interpretation and reading for pleasure. The great grand dame of reading, Margaret Meek, always warned us of the negative effects of the way that we talk about literacy as crammed with a vocabulary of military metaphors, strategies, word attack skills, a metrics culture. Those of you who are parents know it already. Working towards, at, exceeding expected national levels. This is all too often interpreted as low, middle, and top labels, groups, sets, or streams. All persist to this day and powerfully plot children along a developmental continuum, marking some as demonstrably inferior to others. So we felt in this assemblage we wanted to reflect on what a book and reading necessitates working together with what a child thinks, feels, senses, draws, and says.
Yeah, so all that Victoria set out there, Laura Rose's sort of creative resistance to these dominant ideas about what a book is, what a book does, the purpose it serves as a reading primer, and very little else other than a source of distress and despair, really was motivated us to think quite seriously about how research can be something else, and to seriously ask ourselves what counts as research and what counts as method, hence this emergence of the scrabbling methodology, and what and whose knowledge counts as valid. And what we were endeavouring to do was to bring these unlikely partners together in our carrier bag theory, and to start to pose some other questions, some difficult questions, some questions that would generate surprises for us, and to push against the hegemony of developmentalist logic and this narrative that surrounds reading and childhood in quite unhelpful and containing ways. So then, taking up this post-humanist sensibility, we ask ourselves, how does matter matter in research, and why should we make space for matter to matter in the stories that are told about childhood? This on the side, I don't know, Victoria, if you want to speak to this generation of of a response poem from Laura Rose in response to the book.
So the left-hand side is her drawing. As we found things, she has an enormous chair on her boat, which we found a hugely rich pickings. And this is her so-called list. And that's an interesting to me in itself, because an adult idea of a list is more of the thing on the right. But her list is the Scrabble, you know, so it's all of the things that were found. She labels them, many of them misspelt, as you can see, toy parts, but readable, legible, and emergent, highly humorous. You know, it's all about standing. She knows that adults stand on Lego, and her pain, that's what that is, if you stand on a Lego brick. So, you know, they're hugely humorous, most of which is missed out, of course, when she's tested for literacy at school. And we then created this poem with what she had listed in her list. And of course, as an adult, I made it neat. I insisted, right, we're going to try and find a rhyme, because we're going to go with the Moy model, which she was really into. So we reorganized her list into our own down the back of the chair poem.
Beautiful. So what else did you find down the back of the chair? Knits, of course. And so this takes us to this kind of growing body of multi-species childhood research that's currently underway by Paulina Rautio and Rijke Hotti, and amongst many, many others. And it insists that, you know, this is quite unlikely that in a study about reading and childhood that we should be compelled to take the knit seriously, but the knit was a co-researcher, if you like, as significant and as important, with as much to tell us about reading and literacy in childhood and books as any more conventional actors might have to offer. And this quote from Nicolini is really helpful. She's undertaken some research with her own daughter about knits. And the knit is not only itself, it is a vector reliant on relationality for survival. Like human bodies, it's multiple, potentially carrying a microbial wealth to pass on to others. By valuing sketchy lists, rhymes, drawings, collages, and photographic snaps made in moments of immediacy, such as vulnerable literacies, ask us to be willing to learn from what evades language, what digs into our skin, hides in our body, leaves traces we can't eradicate, what resists immediate reading, waits for later to reveal itself, sets off effects we cannot contain.
Yeah, so working with Laura Rosa so closely, head to head, I'm afraid I got knits, she had knits already. Jayne has a perfectly long experience of a daughter with long hair of knits, and it's very common that children of primary age, you know, do have knits over and over again. And it encouraged us to sort of think about the knit as an extraordinary nomadic creature. I mean, it's an obligate parasite, so in that sense, it you know, it lives on us, with us, and it has adapted entirely for that process. And one of the things I found really engaging and interesting was that she saw the knit as her pets, and was, you know, as soon as we got them off her head, and if they were alive, she wanted to keep them. They totally are my pets. If they live on me and drink my blood, they're automatically signing a form that says they're mine. So even institutionalizing that, signing a form, and also drawing them very closely. You can see a close-up here of a knit's head. He looks like a butler who should be retired. You know, that, again, we haven't got time to go into it, but that opened up a huge area that I know post-humanist research is doing some wonderful work on anthropomorphizing, and the strength of children's responses to anthropomorphic animals, and, you know, making creatures part of their world. And I found that particularly interesting in relation to children's literature and, of course, animation and film, because it strikes me that those who are most receptive to this and know perhaps their fount of knowledge are actually children, not adults by any means. And I think we have some more knits. Yeah, so what we then decided to do was create assemblage. These are collages, really, with a drawing of a chair, and then things that we found down the back of the chair, which are placed on the chair. So a chair with stuff found down the back of it. And then the second image is a chair reading a book about hair. And then you have a chair with hair. It's actually got a knit comb already in it. And then you have a knit on a chair, a knit with hair, and a knit with knits.
So practices of literally and metaphorically getting inside the book can be both joyful and troubling. Raising important questions, agitated through a serious recognition of the significance of non, more, other, less than human for childhood studies. It's by taking matter seriously, and not just matter, but parasites, humour, and the fantastical to the heart of our research practices, that the possibilities within anthropomorphizing and the limitations of textual representations of childhood were surfacing and really forcing us to think very seriously and deeply about what all of this was producing and how it was shifting debates and knowledge and further informing our research. So, Victoria, I've got here, you end, but it seems I've ended.
Yes, rather than the ridiculously long list of reading that we became involved in. I think, Le Guin's statement here about, which is actually from an interview, not from the carrier bag theory, but is very much her project in writing a lot of sci-fi and othering worldly stories, is that she is very aware of the crisis that we're in as a planet, and lest there be no more telling of stories at all, we'd better start telling another one. And I'm sure all of you can relate to that. That's something which we're all experiencing politically and felt very much during lockdown, which is when this research took place. And I really feel that working with Jayne in this way, for me too, has really opened up something which is very timely for me, which is in recognizing the composite roles that I've always occupied as a researcher, and felt that universities perhaps don't quite know how to sustain and support, which is that you have a finger in so many pies. If you're in teacher training, if you work in literature and the visual arts, if you're naturally an interdisciplinarian. And so that has released a great deal for me too, about thinking that all of these factors are knowledge and are research and are methodologies which we can explore and can make a really significant contribution as we open all of these factors out. So that's what it's done for me. Okay, right. So we fortunately do have a little bit of time. I was just looking in the chat and the Q&A, and it's mostly to do with my YouTube incompetence, which I imagined it would be. But if anybody has some questions they would like to pose to us, or kind of reflections or thoughts, then please just jump in, unmute yourself and jump in.
I have a question about metaphor. I'll start my video. I wasn't planning to share my video because I've not put any makeup on or brushed my hair. But anyway, but I do have a question about metaphor, about the carrier bag, right? So when you hold a carrier bag, everything's like just junking around inside there, banging into each other. It's all loose parts generally. But what you're talking about felt to me very much more like lots of things folded in with each other, like, you know, you open this up and then you find this, and then you scrabble around in here and you find this, but it's kind of loads of worlds within each other. So I was just interested in kind of whether there was like exploration of lots of alternative metaphors at different points in the scrabbling journey, and kind of, Victoria, obviously metaphor is your thing. So I just like to hear you talk about it. That's not really a question.
I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that you begin with one, don't you? You begin with the bag, which both Jane and I found, you know, is an extraordinary little publication. Really recommend everyone reads it. It's so concise, so beautifully concise, as an entire retelling of evolutionary theory, essentially, an entire retelling of how humans gather knowledge, gather things, and how we think about narrative too, that we don't think about this monolithic, heroic narrative, but we think about the many. And so there were many metaphors, absolutely right, and the chair becomes the next one, and what scrabbling down the back of it actually means and could mean to us. I find it's a really strong methodology to use metaphor, and it's obviously something which occurs very naturally, and in all of your research, I'm sure, has occurred. And I always say to PhD students, let's look at your metaphors, because there's stuff to be found in there. And I think the knit then also became a very strong metaphor as an obligate parasite, which is unusual because it can only exist on us, and therefore we are responsible for its survival. And yet for adults, it's a horror. Normally what adults want to do is remove them and kill them. So Laura Rosa's reaction to keep it as a pet, or keep several as a pet, and then she had a little jar, and she put some hair in because she could see that the knits like the hair, and then she put a few leaves in and so on, because there's that sort of assumption, isn't there, that a creature would like a few leaves and so on. So we had to have conversations about what it was actually that the knit needed. And her mother was not prepared for her to keep it back on her head after having combed it out for hours and hours. So it just brings up that metaphor, a hugely powerful one, of course, about what counts as life on the planet, life that we allow to continue, in life that as humans we're very busy destroying.
Can I just add to that? I think that it's not only a metaphor; it's a practice, and I think this is the case with Haraway's, you know, her string figuring, and when she writes about composting, it's not that it's a metaphor that's an idea for how we might do something. It is actually the doing of it. So the liveliness of the metaphors and the mattering of the metaphors was actually essentially our methodology. So the carrier bag theory is not only theory, but it is practice. They're kind of gathering these unlikely elements, and what do they produce when they come together, and sometimes they produce nothing. You know, that's the other thing, is, you know, the kind of dead ends and cul-de-sacs and of course that's the fun part, but also the really exhausting part, because we have to write a 6,000 7,000 word chapter, but of course there were endless ways in tentacles that we could continue to pursue that were just beyond the realms or the scope of this particular publication. And I suppose that's when we introduce this as our feminist praxis of the everyday and the mundane, then you start to live life in that way, that everything feels like research. And so questioning what is research and what counts as valid knowledge becomes really fundamental to how you live your life, but also the arguments and the propositions that we can put forward that can do serious work, like propose a challenge to developmentalism and the particular narratives that we are constantly bombarded with about literacy and how children should engage with reading and books and how it should be measured. And actually there's a whole other worldview and way to be in the world. I was having a conversation with my daughter about the learning loss discourse, and we had quite a lively discussion about it. But it's only learning loss if you're measuring a particular sort, if you're measuring it, and if you're measuring a particular form of learning, what other learning has gone on. If we switch our lens and attune to what else is going on and how it's manifesting, then there's so much more sort of generative possibilities to hand that we just don't, it kind of gets shut down.
Yeah, I think that's really, Ted, thank you for that. The metaphor. Yes, very nice. Very nice. Actually, Laura Rosa benefited enormously by not being at school. So she was a year out of school, and we have turned that around, her whole attitude to English and literacy, her parents and I, with a concerted effort, but also just her own scrabbling, her own freedom to scrabble and to take a lot of time over what she does has changed things for her very radically. And the rush, to complete work under duress at school, under very quick time conditions, because that was not the case in lockdown, and we gave her loads of time. It's psychologically done her a huge amount of good, and that for me is something I'd like to write up separately, because I think that is a huge indictment of what's going on in schools in terms of literacy.
Okay, we have a couple of sort of questions, and Sid is asking us about middle voice following Jayne Bennett's Efflux recent publication. So do you want to say anything about middle voice in early childhood research?
It does remind of that, and we were also both reading Mushroom at the End of the World, which doesn't bear directly on it, Sid, but you know what it's like. You're reading these pieces and sort of feeling your way. One of the things the editors said to us, actually, Sid, was that how would you categorize what goes on with a child? Is it deep hanging out? And they wanted that categorized, and we sort of resisted it, actually, because we just didn't feel that it sort of helped to categorize what was going on in that moment, partly because we wanted her work and her contributions to just stand and have absolute equivalence with the writing we did.
And I guess this comment from Sarah Stanley around, well, what if it wasn't a carrier bag? What if it were a wicker basket? Which is fabulous, because, yeah, the possibilities are kind of endless. And Louise Hawkswell has actually responded with a recommendation to read Anna Zing, and I would second that. It's amazing, but it is the receptacle, the thing that's used to gather together all these bits is interesting and valuable in and of itself. And I think actually the imagery for the carrier bag is often not the plastic carrier bag that you get in the supermarket, but it's the string bag, or it's the bag lady, actually material bag, cloth bags, leather bags. All of that tells a whole stack of stories in and of itself. Like, what is the bag? What is the holder? But the point is, the holder is not one thing. And that's where the possibilities are kind of then multiplied again.
Absolutely, Mona. Laura Rosa is a named author. Yeah, absolutely. One of my first articles ever was with a 10-year-old, and to be honest, she made a much, much more profound contribution to the article than I did. So they should always be named, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got the bag thing is Moomin Mama's carrier bag, absolutely.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But it is somebody had mentioned that it matters because it's culture emerges. So Nora, thank you. Culture emerges from the carrier bag, from cultural practice. Absolutely, a carrier bag in South London on a boat is a very different thing from a leather bag or a Moomin bag in the Swedish forest, or a bag in it's gathering shiitake mushrooms that Zing sort of followed. So absolutely, it's the bag is.
I didn't really dwell on that, but one of the things about the nomadic that sort of fitted is that is how we are treated living on houseboats, where when I first moved onto a houseboat, I realized that you have a sense of what communities that move, how those communities are how they feel and how they're treated by institutional practices. So Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities, you can't get grants for things, you can't get credit from the bank people can't recognize you because you don't have a house number. You know, you begin to realize the prejudices and difficulties for nomadic communities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really important.
Does any, I think, where did I see another comment from Paula Nottingham around the ability to think in pictures, visual literacy, and she references Gardner intelligences, love the combination of approaches, complexity of meaning. And I think that's, you know, that was the, I think, I don't know if we want to say anything, Victoria, about, you know, the encouragement for us to define what we were doing as research creation, and us saying it's arts based, it's an artistic kind of speculative post-humanist practice. It's not necessarily research creation per se.
Yeah, we were quite resistant to the categories, because I think the publication in general is focusing a bit on the whole notion of after childhood, you know, after the child, which we're both Jayne and I were highly resistant to, and I'm always really suspicious of prepositional metaphors like that anyway, because I've already explained before, at, exceeding, after, you know, we're on the same continuum straight away.
Yeah, so I guess it's a kind of conscious what are we doing, and whilst also embracing this kind of emergence and speculative not knowing, but also knowing where we don't want to go, and the traps we don't want to fall into. But it's oh, 3 new messages.
I think that, yes, Amelia and Ted, you're so right to cite Winnicott, because Winnicott is behind me all of the time. The idea of play, the metaphoric and process power of play, is behind a great deal of that. And if we'd written a different article which was about the relationship between ourselves and Laura Rosa, it would of course include that. And in the article is a lovely scene that I saw from my boat, because she's on a boat 2 along. I can see her front deck, and she was with a friend after we'd been doing some of this work together on knits, and she has these big plastic insects, just toys, and they had a doll's house out on the deck, and they were playing with the insects, tucking them up into bed, and then calling in sort of cross adult voices, time for blood, it's dinner time for blood. And I was laughing on my boat, you know, thinking about the power dynamic literally that's acted out in play, you know, of both child, adult, toy, and all of those transitional objects in between. Wonderful.
Yeah, I feel like we are actually technically over time. We're supposed to finish at 12:45, but the questions are still coming. So we have one from Pam Bernard here. These new configurations of interactive practices as research co-constitute past, presents and futures and multiple diffractions that form a vital part of the creation of a phenomenon. Wondering if you could tell us a little more about the diffractive differences in the remaking of meaning through your research. The spookiness of power dynamics between human and more than human and non-human is contained in entanglements itself with knits.
Well, I think she said it already very beautifully. Yes. You're just going to have to read the article, I'm going to have to say, Pam, because that we do try to go into that a little bit, don't we? We've had to be very quick, and we have definitely entered into knits more in the article, and explored the role of that extraordinary little creature in relation to some of the lovely research that we did cite on ticks. That's a very beautiful piece of research, by the way. I really strongly recommend it, by Nicolini.
So we were waiting for Laura Rose to agree to be named as a co-author on the paper before we pop this up to academia.edu and ResearchGate, and she's very, very happy to be named as our co-author. We can't name the knits, but they're all our co-authors too. But we'll pop that up on academia.edu and ResearchGate and Middlesex University Repository. So any of you who might be interested in reading the full article will have access to it. I think at this point, I just want to thank you all for engaging with our ideas. And yeah, it's been a really fun and troubling and yeah, wonderful collaboration, and we're glad that it's been useful or interesting to you in some sense. So yeah, and just keep an eye out for the next seminar in the series, and we look forward to welcoming you to that. Okay.